Good morning. I'm Matt Logan. I'm the Executive Director of Montgomery History. I want to welcome you this morning to the Jane Sween Research Library and Special Collections on our campus here in Rockville for what promises to be a very special program. To get things started, I would like to begin by sharing a message from Shanta Vaughn, the President of Montgomery History.
Good morning. I am Shanta Vaughn, President of the Montgomery History Board of Directors, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's symposium. This symposium is Montgomery History's contribution to Remembrance Weekend, which is a joint effort between Montgomery History, the Montgomery County Remembrance and Reconciliation Commission, and the Montgomery County Lynching Memorial Project. Our purpose is to promote awareness and understanding of the horrific acts of racial terror historically inflicted upon African Americans in our area. As an organization, Montgomery History is committed to collecting, sharing, and interpreting history that represents everyone who lives in Montgomery County. We believe that by acknowledging all parts of our history, including the difficult or painful episodes, we are better able to learn from them in order to foster safe and welcoming communities now and in the future. Understanding how lynchings unfolded is an essential act of remembrance, and uncovering the roots of those acts is necessary in order to begin the journey towards reconciliation and healing. Thank you for joining us for this important program. All of us at Montgomery History look forward to working with you as we continue our mission to make local history relevant, accessible, inclusive, and engaging for all residents of Montgomery County and around the world.
Thank you, Shanta, and thank you to everyone on our Board of Directors for their thoughtful leadership. Today we're going to examine the lynchings of two black men, Mr. John Diggs-Dorsey and Mr. Sidney Randolph, that occurred in the late 19th century in Rockville, just blocks from where I stand today. These gruesome incidents and the climate in which they were allowed to transpire has, until now, been inadequately researched, discussed, and understood. Before we get to our guests and speakers, I want to explain how we came to use unwritten law in the title of this symposium. That phrase came to us from a June 6, 1896 article in the Washington Bee, a black newspaper in D.C. In a section heading entitled "A Negro to Die," in a larger article about the attack on the Buxton family in which Sidney Randolph was ultimately lynched, the editorialist for the Bee writes, "Some Negro must hang. That is a settled question. The unwritten law of Maryland is that if a white person is killed and the murderer cannot be found, some Negro must hang for it." In other words, these acts of violence were not random or unpredictable or perpetrated by a handful of deranged men. As this writer indicates, lynchings were used here and throughout the country to maintain a social order and racial hierarchy. They were calculated, and many people were both complicit in the acts and or benefited from the resulting terror. These scars don't magically disappear over time, and that is why what you are going to hear today is so relevant to our county in 2021 and beyond. It's important to note that there was a third confirmed lynching that took place in Montgomery County in 1880, that of Mr. George Peck. In November 2019, the Montgomery County Lynching Memorial Project and its partners organized a soil collection ceremony in Poolesville at the site of Mr. Peck's murder. Tomorrow, the Lynching Memorial Project and the county's Remembrance and Reconciliation Commission are hosting a soil collection for Mr. Diggs-Dorsey and Mr. Randolph. If you haven't registered yet, I encourage you to do so now. A link to that registration page is available in the chat. Following each of our presenters, we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Our first presenter today is Ralph Buglass, who will describe the larger historical context in which the lynchings took place. Ralph's bio and a description of his session, along with that for the other presenters, is available on our website, and a link is provided in the chat. Before we hear from Ralph, I'd like to share a message from County Council Member Craig Rice. He, along with Council Members Will Jawando and Hans Reamer, sponsored the creation of the Remembrance and Reconciliation Commission, and have been enthusiastic supporters of this work from the very beginning. We'll hear from all of them later in the program. But first, Mr. Craig Rice.
Hi, I'm Montgomery County Council Member Craig Rice, and I'm pleased to be with you today for the Remembrance and Reconciliation ceremony. It's important for us to remember that in order for us to acknowledge our history and heal, we have to make sure that we're acknowledging the transgressions of the past. And that means understanding the fact that there were innocent Black people who were murdered, who were lynched, not only in the Deep South, where my family is from, but right here in Montgomery County. We need to make sure that people understand that those types of transgressions still have impacts on the Black community today. That is the reason why racial equity and social justice means so much. It's the reason why the work that we do to undo those challenges of the past continues, and that they need to be at the forefront and woven into every single thing that we do. So I want to say thank you to the Commission, to those who played a part in making sure that people understand and remember their history, and that we continue to make a vow to move forward together, understanding that these things happened, and they are the reason why we find ourselves in the position today, but that we can overcome them by working together, by ensuring that racial equity and social justice is woven into all of the decisions that we make, so that we can right those injustices of the past. Take care, everyone, and God bless.
Good morning. I'm Ralph Buglass. I hope in this first presentation to lay the groundwork for this important weekend by looking at the racial climate in Montgomery County around the time of the two lynchings that we're remembering. Now, it may be stating the obvious, but needs to be said right up front. Montgomery County at this time was a very different place. Stands to reason. We're talking more than 100 years ago, but it wasn't just some sort of sepia-toned, old-fashioned version of life today. Very different demographically, socially, politically, economically. Montgomery County was primarily rural and agricultural. County government was small and limited. Democrats were firmly in control, conservative Democrats, by and large, former Confederates and Southern sympathizers. So keep all this in mind for this retrospective on race, roughly from the end of the Civil War to the end of the 1800s. The picture I'll paint is one of a rigidly segregated society, imposing a fragile and fraught existence for most African Americans. Now, I seldom give such prominence to the old Confederate statue that once stood here in our county seat, but it's quite apt for our purposes today. It indeed faced south. We need to face this history, as difficult and uncomfortable as it is. Installed around the end of the time frame that we're looking at, the statue symbolizes Montgomery County's Southern orientation in the late 19th century. Its prominent location and dedication, featuring top officials, underscores the county as a place where, frankly, white supremacy was the prevailing notion and had been since the end of the Civil War. And ironically, the county jail was just a block away, about where the county council office building is today. Both of the men, as you heard, were taken from the jail by vigilante groups, one in 1880, the other in 1896. Now, a caveat, I necessarily have to paint with a broad brush to give a sense of our county in the second half of the 19th century. History, of course, is complex and nuanced, and there are exceptions to everything. But to the extent possible, my goal is to give an overall view of the times. Context is important. First, population. On the eve of the Civil War, nearly 40% of our population was African American. Of the 7,000 Black people, about 3/4 were enslaved, since the county was mostly agricultural. Now, fast forward to 1900, the end of the period we're looking at. About 33% Black, 10,000 total. So still a significantly biracial county. But the Black population steadily decreasing in proportion to whites. Now, just FYI, when suburbanization took off in the 20th century, it largely left Blacks out. Even some moved away due to so few job opportunities. And residential restrictive covenants prevented others from moving in. So that by 1960, well beyond the period that we're talking about, but to give the big picture, by 1960, African Americans made up just 4% of our county's population. Then the numbers increased again, and of course today we are a majority minority, very diverse county. But back to the late 19th century, following the Civil War, Blacks clustered in communities all over the county, truly enclaves unto themselves, very close-knit, often kinship communities of extended families. It was banding together for mutual support and self-sufficiency. Churches were established as the central institution, then schools, sometimes even before a church. African Americans interacting with whites mainly for employment, the vast majority as farmhands or domestics. The few Black professionals were teachers or ministers. No African American doctor in all of Montgomery County until well into the 20th century. So limited medical care. Blacks not welcomed in stores, but no sharecropping, virtually a reimposition of slavery, as was the case in the Deep South. Still a hard scrabble life, most just barely eking out an existence. But those who could always dressed to the nines, reflecting personal pride and to bolster self-esteem. Education had long been denied and was highly valued as a result. So these early communities started schools right away, largely on their own, but with some help, as I'll detail later. And in time, schools were provided slowly by the county, public schools, but completely separate and in no way equal to the already existing schools for white children. And like in the Deep South, Montgomery County schools were segregated by law up until the mid-20th century. More on schools coming up. But first, some context nationally and to the rest of Maryland. Nationally, this period was marked by the failure to incorporate Blacks as full citizens of this country. After federal troops were withdrawn from the South in the 1970s, it was a worsening situation for Blacks. Jim Crow segregation and discrimination and harsh conditions were becoming entrenched, culminating in the so-called separate but equal doctrine enshrined into law, but really codifying rigid segregation and inequality, and against a backdrop of increasing racial terror and the rise of the KKK further south. Here in Maryland, near the end of the Civil War, a new constitution for our state abolished slavery, allowed for Confederates to be denied voting rights, and created a public education system, but initially for white children only. Now, that was quite a progressive constitution. It passed mostly because many Maryland Confederate soldiers were away fighting. But reflecting sentiments here in Montgomery County, it was strongly opposed, roughly 3-1 against that new constitution. And in very short order, Confederate sympathizers reasserted their power. It's very complicated, but a new constitution just 3 years later reversed course, and according to one historian, marked a move back to white supremacy. It restored voting to Southern sympathizers while not extending voting to Blacks. Black citizenship rights and voting rights supposedly were guaranteed by new amendments to the federal Constitution, the 14th and the 15th Amendments. Now, they applied here in Maryland, as they supposedly did in the Deep South, where they were largely subverted. And it's worth noting that Maryland did not officially ratify those amendments until well into the 20th century. African-American voting rights in Maryland were always tenuous in the late 19th century. And by the early 20th century, there was a formal attempt in the legislature in Annapolis to take away African Americans' voting rights through various mechanisms, much like in the Deep South. Ultimately, that was defeated here. So while public education, free public education, survived this backswing right after the Civil War, it wasn't until nearly a decade later that a new law extended public schooling to Blacks, but explicitly separate right down to the budgets, meager tax dollars from Blacks and only from them going to the Black schools. So separate was the byword in many ways. African Americans banding together to form communities in the face of white hostility or at best indifference, forming churches and schools as the central institutions to strengthen bonds. But it was not just separation by choice or perhaps by necessity, but also forced segregation imposed by law, mostly notably in the schools that were not at all equal. And individual equality with rights and full citizenship rights, iffy, unthinkable to many whites' way of thinking. Later came another important community institution, benevolent societies. These were mutual aid organizations for things like burial insurance, or often the only place to get together socially in a segregated society. Now, what I've just described was the case broadly speaking. As the authoritative historian Eric Foner writes, Blacks turned inward, building and bolstering community, not directly challenging segregation and worsening conditions. This history specifically of Maryland notes that the post-Civil War period represented a long struggle for Black people in Maryland to become free and equal citizens, a long struggle. This book also notes that employment insecurity was ever present for Blacks through the last 3 decades of the 19th century. Absolutely true here in Montgomery County. This excellent new history of one of the many post-Civil War Black communities, Sugar Land, notes that residents had hard lives working for low wages, their distant white neighbors not really regarding them as equals. So Blacks relied on faith, represented, as I've said, by the church, as we've seen, and faith in education as a way of getting ahead, or at least getting by. Sugar Land, just one of nearly 50 major African American communities after the Civil War, with either a church, a school, and or a benevolent society. There they are, all mapped. And if you add in smaller enclaves, at least 68, probably others, perhaps as many as 100 altogether, some unfortunately lost to history. But west of Poolesville, we have a rare site with all 3 of these community institutions still standing, the only site in Maryland and maybe beyond So important that that benevolent society building was recently restored after nearly falling down. Now, a deeper dive into what life was like in Montgomery County beginning right after the Civil War. It comes from documents of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was the federal agency established to help Blacks all over the South adjust to a new way of life. It had an office right here in Montgomery County in Rockville. The Army supervisor of that office wrote in 1866, "I am informed that a building put up by the colored people about 5 miles above Rockville for a church and schoolhouse was set fire to and destroyed." He goes on, "No assistance from county or state funds is given to the colored people for their schools." Further on, he explicitly notes that Southern sympathizers outnumber Unionists among white people, who, he says, frequently throw obstacles in the way of the establishment of churches and schools for Blacks. As for African Americans, generally they, quote, manifest a desire to avoid trouble with the white people and frequently submit to imposition through fear of gaining their ill will by complaining. Mull that for a moment. So the Bureau stepped in to provide help in building schools for Blacks. Here's an order for building materials for a schoolhouse for freed children in Rockville. This portion says, the colored people there have a deed for property and are ready to put up the schoolhouse. Indeed, a Black woman in Rockville sold the property for $1, essentially contributing it to the community for the good of all. The deed specifying it was for, quote, the use, benefit, and education of the colored people of Montgomery County forever. And by 1869, the Freedmen's Bureau helped to establish here in Montgomery County not only that Rockville school and one already in existence in Sandy Spring by the end of the Civil War. Now, as a Quaker community, Sandy Spring had a significant antebellum free African American population. Altogether, 8 other schools, all later becoming public schools run by the county. This shows again how valued education was. As Eric Foner says, the newly freed African Americans had a seemingly unquenchable thirst for education. Or as the 19th century Black leader Booker T. Washington wrote, it was a whole race trying to go to school, few too young, none too old. Public schools for African American children run by the county came slowly, as I said, a full 10 years after being required to provide schooling for Blacks. The county had built on its own, at most, only 6 schools. Another 15 held in churches or benevolent society lodges, and 7 were buildings constructed by post-Civil War Black communities, often with the Freedmen's Bureau help. One school the county built later is a school museum today. And on display are a sewing machine and tools, because in addition to academics, which were stressed, girls were taught to be domestics and boys to be farm and manual laborers. So limited were job opportunities in the segregated society of the late 19th century. Ironically, this school was built in 1896, the very year that the Supreme Court enshrined into law the separate but equal doctrine. But as I said, nothing equal about the schools here in Montgomery County. Specifically, the Black schools were overcrowded, got only hand-me-down books. The teachers paid about half what white teachers got. The Black schools had a shorter school year to begin with, and would close early when separate budget ran out of money, in one case as early as March. Even some hand-me-down buildings. This white school was moved to the site of a burned-down black school. It's this portion of the building still standing on Route 28 near the police headquarters. This report by the federal government gives a look at cold, hard numbers. The county in the late 19th century into the 20th had been spending 5 times as much on each white student as each African American student. Now, this report, also called the Black Schools Neglected and Dilapidated, but reflecting the value that Blacks placed on education, a slightly higher percentage of Black children were attending school than were white children, 58 to 51%. And this is before compulsory education. And that report noted that the white and Black teachers in the schools were roughly equally qualified. Quite remarkable, since higher education opportunities for Blacks were so limited at this time. For example, no high school for Blacks until well after the period that we're focusing on, and not at all comparable to the white high school that had been built 25 years earlier. A Black teacher with 40 students in her one-room school summed it up best. The county doesn't send many resources our way, so we do the best we can with help from parents and the community, the whole community. And I myself always bring extra lunch to share so no one goes hungry. Now back to the Freedmen's Bureau for just a moment. Besides helping to build schools, its other main purpose was to settle disputes between whites and the formerly enslaved. A noteworthy case involved a white doctor striking a so-called impertinent Rockville Black man. The doctor did stand trial, but justice was not assured. The Freedmen's Bureau superintendent reported that the state's attorney, that's the prosecutor, a well-known local figure, William Beers Buick, was believed to be hostile towards civil rights for Blacks and had alluded to the Freedmen's Bureau as an institution of tyranny. When Buick in court spoke of, quote, the noble Confederate soldiers, spectators applauded. The Army supervisor added that the difficulties encountered in obtaining justice for the freedmen are due to the opposition of a large majority of the community, as well as to the opposition of nearly all the civil officers of the county. They do no more, he said, for the freedmen than they are forced to, and they use their influence to dissuade freedmen from bringing cases against white men, sometimes using intimidation and misrepresentation to prevent freedmen from obtaining justice. In fact, accepting Blacks' testimony in court was a major issue all over after the Civil War. So it brings us to administration of justice and government here in Montgomery County in later years, around the time of the lynchings. This means county government, housed almost entirely in an old courthouse, replaced by the iconic red brick courthouse in 1891. Government very different than today. As I said, small and limited in scope, controlled by conservative Democrats. Power really lay in Annapolis. Residents elected 1 state senator and 3 delegates by district, just as we do today, to send to the General Assembly in Annapolis, which really made the laws affecting any particular county. The other key state elected official was state's attorney. That was William Beers Buick, right after the Civil War, who I just described. He was later a judge here in Montgomery County from 1867 all the way to 1882. County government, what little it did, was run by 5 elected commissioners, nearly all of whom were Democrats. Remember, conservative Democrats. This history of Montgomery County notes quite pointedly, the primary issue in politics here after 1867 was white supremacy. The Democrats captured this issue and made it their rallying cry in election after election. And in fact, nationally, Democrats in 1868 ran on the explicit theme, quote, "This is a white man's country, let white men rule." And even though the Republican Party was still the party of Lincoln and emancipation, this book adds, nearly every white voter in Montgomery County, Democrat or Republican, Unionist or Southern sympathizer, would have agreed on one major premise. Blacks could not be enslaved any longer, but they could not be equal citizens either. So a quick look at law enforcement. Bare bones might be the best way to sum it up. We didn't even have a county police department until the 1920s. This book about law enforcement here in Montgomery County, about the time we're focusing on, says that there was only one elected sheriff who actually had a lot of other responsibilities beyond law enforcement. And while we don't have party affiliations for the sheriffs, that sheriff was picked by the same people electing all those conservative Democrats. Other points made by this book: the sheriff appointed deputies, but they were by and large private citizens needed only when things came up, paid on a fee basis, not a regular salary. They had little professional training, and not many legal procedures were in place. No such thing as regular patrols or emergency response. The book concludes, protection of the law was usually sketchy at best. And in 1885, right between the 2 lynchings, the state found that the Montgomery County Jail was one of the 3 worst in the state due to disorderly and neglected conditions. Yet commissioners wouldn't build a new one. Now, this picture of the jail that I showed earlier, it doesn't show an escape through the roof. It's being dismantled in the 1930s. But you can see it's basically a house, yes, built of stone, more secure against fire that had burned down an earlier wooden jail, but basically a house. The jailer, appointed by the sheriff, lived there, but it was used only for temporary detention, holding people until trial. Those actually serving a sentence were held in the Maryland State Penitentiary. And speaking of the administration of justice, I've talked about State's Attorney, later Judge William Veers Buick. Now, things aren't always black and white, so to speak. Another judge involved in the 1880 case, as the next speaker, Sarah Headland, will explain, was a bit different in outlook than Buick. Judge Richard Johns Bowie. Full names often used in those days. Before I end, I should point out the Black communities, specifically in Rockville at the time of the lynchings. First, Hayti along Martin's Lane, near where the post office is today. It was formed by free Blacks before the Civil War and then grew with formerly enslaved people after the war. Mainly residential and small farms, Hayti still exists, some homes owned by generations of the same family. Much closer to the center of town, a more densely settled area around Middle Lane and North Washington Street. Today, Middle Lane abuts Rockville Town Square. This neighborhood was to a large extent eliminated by 1950s displacement. Little to remind us today. There is, though, still Jerusalem Mount Pleasant Methodist Church on nearby Wood Lane, a very historically significant African-American church. And a very important Black community that came about in the time period was Lincoln Park, when a white store owner set aside plots of land east of the railroad, now Metro, for sale as home sites exclusively to Blacks beginning in 1891. So it was forming in the interim between the two lynchings we're discussing today. Lastly, the longtime Montgomery County Sentinel tells much about this period, though in its day, it mainly reinforced the prevailing white narrative. Its publisher was very influential and very conservative. When he died, business was suspended here in the county seat. The paper remained much the same after his death. One local history says the dominant and unabashedly Democratic Sentinel constantly kept the population, that is, the white population, in fear of, quote, Negro crime or revolt. And specifically about the 1880 lynching, it editorialized, for such fiendish deeds, the perpetrator has forfeited every right to a legitimate trial by jury. When the Sentinel in 1873 refused to publish a notice of the death of Samuel Martin, the patriarch of Hayti in Rockville, an African-American newspaper in Washington took notice of, quote, the deep-seated and continued prejudice in Montgomery County. And just recently, a New York Times columnist put some perspective on the effect of such biased reporting. He wrote, newspapers that championed white supremacy through the pre-civil rights South paved the way for lynching by declaring African Americans non-persons. Now, that earlier reference in the Sentinel to fiendish deeds requires us to confront squarely, bottom line, you might say, regarding race, certainly in this period and throughout much of our nation's history, not just white supremacy, which underlay much of what I've been talking about, but quote unquote white purity and miscegenation, particularly Black men assaulting white women and, heaven forbid, girls. In much of the white world, it was deemed so taboo that it caused some people, you might say, to go beyond ballistic in reaction. That's a big element in the two cases we're looking at today, as well as the other known lynching in Montgomery County, for which, as you heard, a soil collection ceremony like tomorrow's has already been held. And indeed, the Equal Justice Institute has found, quote, whites' fears of interracial sex a big factor in lynchings. Well, to sum up, Montgomery County in these times, we've moved from that Freedmen's Bureau report noting Blacks not wanting to anger whites to separatism, to band together for mutual support and community, but also because of enforced segregation, most notably in the schools that were not at all equal. Generally not easy lives, African Americans just trying to get by. I'll let the Sugarland book have the last word from a chapter aptly titled, Hope in Time of Uncertainty. Residents knew emancipation from slavery was not quite the same as freedom. Faced with uncertainty, they focused on creating community to improve their prospects for the future. So one last quick note, this map of Montgomery County's African-American communities is on the web, mappingsegregationdc.org. Click on Historic Black Communities. It's part of a metro-wide project and it's interactive. Click on a blue dot. Jonesville, here in Montgomery County. An African-American family's post-Civil War log cabin from Jonesville is now in the Smithsonian African-American History Museum downtown, and as a result, has been called the most visited house in America. A deserved honor to mark the Black community's perseverance in the face of separate white and Black societies, which interacted mainly for jobs and by necessity, but the interactions tragic at times, as we'll hear from the next two speakers. But first, some time for questions.
Thank you, Ralph. What a wonderful way to get the symposium started today. I would like to get things started with a question regarding the church. And I do encourage people to use the Q&A function to send in your questions as you may have them. You had mentioned churches.
Yes.
And specifically the Jerusalem Mount Pleasant Church, which is right around the corner here. What were some of the others from the period that survived to this day?
I showed one in Martinsburg. It's right on White's Ferry Road as you're heading out to the ferry, which may be running again. And by and large, Methodist churches, AME churches, African Methodist Episcopal, AME Zion. There was a church, Clinton AME Zion, right in the Middle Lane community in Rockville. It was, as I said, displaced, and it is thriving today in a new spot in the historic African-American community of Lincoln Park. A number of churches still exist around the county, both white and Black. You'll recognize them as generally small white buildings with a small steeple, often with a bell. One church I'd like to mention in particular near Damascus. It was built with the help of the Freedmen's Bureau, still standing today. It's been added on to, but it's as a result the only building was still standing here in Montgomery County, Pleasant Hill Community Church, and significant also because while it is the only building associated with the Freedmen's Bureau, it was used as a public school for many years, all the way up until 1939, called the Purdom School, Purdom Colored School. And so that school actually never got a building of its own, sort of reflect the official neglect by the county of the Black schools.
Thank you, Ralph. Questions are coming in. We've got a bunch of them. A lot of folks want to thank you, longtime residents who've indicated that, you know, you're helping them to better understand this county.
As I think we heard at the opening, history that hasn't been told enough.
Can you speak a little bit more about the Hayti community in Rockville and the significance of them naming their community Hayti?
Yeah, we don't know for sure. Probably a reference to Haiti, spelled the same way. Again, reflecting heritage and racial pride.
We have a question about Black cemeteries.
Yes, a number of Black cemeteries in varying states, varying condition today. Some well maintained, often next to a church, some in spots where you really wouldn't expect to find a cemetery. I'll mention one in particular. It's in Cabin John. It's along Seven Locks Road. It's associated with the Cabin John Black community, which by and large does not exist. There is a church on Seven Locks Road, which is associated with that cemetery. The church is unfortunately in bad condition today. But that cemetery, long forgotten, it's come under the wing of concerned citizens, and it was recently named one of the most endangered historic spots all across the country. It lies, you can't see it, but it lies right next to the Beltway between the American Legion Bridge and River Road. And with that designation, it will already has impacted plans for widening the Beltway. Care has to be taken to preserve that cemetery. Luckily.
There was a question regarding the symposium, whether it's being recorded. And yes, it is being recorded, and that will be made available perhaps as early as Monday on our website. So we'll be sure to check back for that. Question regarding, was there any Catholic influence in the county?
I don't want to diminish any Catholic influence. I can't speak directly to it. Of course, the oldest church in Rockville is St. Mary's Catholic Church.
Exactly.
The chapel that stands there today is the original church that stands there. It's right at Veers Mill Road and Rockville Pike. And African Americans did worship in that chapel, though, as of course you probably know, sat in the balcony. But by and large, the main denominations were Methodist, and I should have mentioned also Baptist as far as for Black churches.
Interesting question about funeral homes. Were there Black funeral homes?
And surviving today, thriving today. The Snowden Funeral Home here in Rockville. And indeed, one of the vestiges, along with Jerusalem Mount Pleasant Church, of that downtown Rockville neighborhood. Snowden Funeral Home at the corner of Bell Avenue and North Washington Street. It is, I think, a fourth generation family business. Others as well, but that comes to mind.
Let's see, other than the Freedmen's Bureau, who in the 19th century here in Montgomery County advocated for Blacks?
I think that the fact that I'm at a loss is that just reinforces what I was saying of the difficulty of life for Blacks at the time. And not to say that there weren't any, I can't pinpoint right now.
Sure. Can you speak to some of the sources that you used?
Yes, I tried to show them. I used both primary and secondary sources. And I think there's probably no better source for Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War, than Eric Foner, a now retired Columbia University professor, who has, along with other historians, sort of flipped the script that many older residents may be more familiar with, that Reconstruction was a time of carpetbaggers, as it were, Northerners coming down to the South to for corruptive purposes of corruption, steal money. Scallywags is another derogatory term. In fact, it was definitely a revolutionary time. Blacks now citizens. But it was a hopeful time, but did as I said, ultimately failed. Federal troops were pulled out of the South, and white supremacists were able to reassert control. So both primary and secondary sources.
What about the newspapers? How did you access the Sentinel, for instance?
The Sentinel is available. Probably you can talk a little more about this if need be. The Sentinel is available on microfilm. Yes, that's how old it is. At the Rockville Library, the reference section in the Rockville Library. And again, I used the Sentinel, but also secondary sources. I thought people had studied it better than I, who were able to draw some conclusions, like the excerpts that I gave in the presentation.
Right. Excellent. Well, Ralph, do you have any closing thoughts? Or
no, I would only urge people that yes, this is being recorded, and so tell others about it.
And can your presentation be made available via?
I can have the narrative made available. Slides, I probably can't because there may be some copyrighted images, which just showing as a one-time use here. The map, though, is very important, and that is online.
Oh, excellent.
I'll just say it again, mappingsegregationdc.org.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ralph.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
And now I believe we have a message from County Council Member Will Jawando. When we return, Sarah Headland will give a presentation detailing the 2 lynchings.
Hi, I'm Councilmember Will Jawando, an at-large member of the Montgomery County Council and one of the co-sponsors of the Reconciliation and Remembrance Commission here in Montgomery County. It's a pleasure to be with you today to discuss a very important but difficult topic. Lynchings represent one of the most heinous and darkest parts of the American story. And it's often something that people don't want to talk about, but we must, because we have to remember why they happened. The act itself, the brutality of it and the injustice was a way to enforce systems of white supremacy that we still see intact today. It was a way to intimidate African Americans and Black Americans. And it was a form of racial terrorism. According to the Tuskegee Institute, 4,743 people were lynched between 1882 and 1968 in the United States. And that's probably an undercount, including 3,446 African Americans. Though the numbers vary, historians say that at least 44 lynchings took place in Maryland, including 3 documented lynchings here in Montgomery County. This weekend, with the partnership of Montgomery History, a great organization, at the Symposium, we are recognizing 2 of the 3 African-American men who were victims of lynching in Montgomery County, particularly in the Rockville area, Mr. John Diggs-Dorsey and Mr. Sidney Randolph. Mr. Randolph was pulled out of the Rockville jail, which is now the site of where I sit as a council member, along with my colleagues. He was pulled out of that building and lynched. It's a stark reminder about the history of our county and this type of terrorism. In 2019, the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill was introduced, unfortunately only to be blocked by Senator Rand Paul, and has recently been introduced in the House and is sitting in a subcommittee. It's something we desperately need to pass, and raising awareness of lynchings across the country helps that to happen. When Councilmember Reamer and Councilmember Rice and I introduced the resolution to form the Remembrance and Reconciliation Commission in January of 2019, the goal was to bring our county together to promote better understanding of our history and prevention of these types of atrocities in the future, not only here at home, but across the world. We see modern day examples of racial terrorism across our country in the form of police violence, vigilante justice, white supremacist organizations. And so it's really important that we understand that these things are not new and that they have our roots in the American story. I want to thank our Reconciliation and Remembrance Commission for organizing the activities of this weekend. I want to thank Montgomery History for putting this symposium together. We can never forget this important history. Otherwise, we're doomed to repeat it. And understanding the origins of racial injustice and inequities and what has happened in the past in Montgomery County help us chart a better future where everyone has opportunity and justice under the law here in the county. So it's great to be with you. I hope you're enjoying the day and look forward to being in touch soon. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Headland. I'm a librarian and archivist for Montgomery History. I've also been one of the lead researchers on this several years long project to document these Montgomery County lynchings more fully. In answer to the challenge put forward by the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, for communities across the country to engage with these injustices from our past in an effort to begin the journey toward reconciliation. Today, I'm going to relate the painful stories of two lynchings that took place in Rockville: the murders of Mr. John Diggs-Dorsey in 1880 and Sidney Randolph in 1896. Lynching is defined as extrajudicial killing by a group of people, usually white men, taking a person merely accused of a crime, usually a Black man, from the custody of appointed lawmakers and murdering that person before a trial or a conviction or a sentence has been reached through the usual legal proceedings. In former slave states like Maryland, lynching was an act of racial terrorism that sent a message to the Black community. Justice was not for them, and white supremacy was assumed and enforced. So I have two disclaimers for this talk. First, I trust everyone on this symposium understands that this is a very difficult topic to hear about. And while I try to avoid getting too graphic, there's a certain amount of uncomfortable violence I have to describe to do justice to these stories. Second, the only accounts we have of these stories come from the newspapers, which are an extremely unreliable source. They need to be read with a high level of skepticism for several reasons. They're full of errors, as well as the biases of the people and of the time in which they were written. In our case, with very few exceptions, they are accounts written by white people for an exclusively white readership. Therefore, they described these events and these people in terms that that audience expected to hear. For example, accused Black men were referred to as brutes and fiends and other derogatory things, while the white citizens were described as upstanding, noble, estimable, and other respectable terms. So we have to, when we're reading these accounts, realize that this narrative had an agenda. And it's up to us, looking back at the past, to realize the limitation of that lens that we're using to view it. So as you've heard, there were a total of 3 lynchings that we know of in Montgomery County. 2 of them happened in 1880 and 1 in 1896. The first lynching in January 1880 was that of Mr. George Peck, a young man from the Poolsville area. But we are focusing today on the lynchings that happened in Rockville. The murders of John Diggs-Dorsey in July of 1880 and Sidney Randolph in July of 1896. So neither of these men who died in Rockville actually lived there. John Diggs-Dorsey lived in Darnestown, and after he became a suspect and a fugitive, he was hunted for 2 days throughout the county, then lodged in the Rockville jail, where he stayed for only a few hours before he was dragged out and lynched. Sidney Randolph was a stranger to Montgomery County. He didn't live here at all, but he was arrested for a crime committed in Gaithersburg, eventually also taken from the Rockville jail and lynched. So even though the crimes these men were accused of happened in other towns, their deaths happened in Rockville because they were in jail in Rockville. So here you're looking at a rendering of the Rockville area created by the B&O Railroad Company in 1890. So most of this is accurate, but some of it depicts areas of planned or intended development. So not just what already existed, but it's a decent big picture visual depiction of Rockville for both these stories. The jail building, which had been built during the Civil War, was located here, a block behind the courthouse on what was then known as Perry Street and now called Maryland Avenue, in the area where the county council office building stands today. It was a 2-story stone structure with cells on at least 2 floors and also contained living quarters for the jailer. It was sturdy enough, but not really any kind of fortress. The walls were stone, but the door was wooden, so breaking in was really not very difficult. So in 1880, John Diggs-Dorsey, who was accused of a crime that took place in Darnestown, was taken from the jail to the outskirts of town along Darnestown Road, now Montgomery Avenue. This house that still stands on the corner of Forest Avenue, oops, sorry, I clicked through too fast there. The house that stands on the corner of Forest Avenue was built in 1879, and in 1880 was probably the last one before you passed into stretches of trees and farmland. So after they had killed their victim, the lynchers of John Diggs-Dorsey, who were thought mostly to be from Darnestown, continued along that road to their home. In 1896, Sidney Randolph, who was accused of a crime that happened in Gaithersburg, was taken from the jail in a wagon through the west end of town and out to Frederick Road, so 355, about a mile out of town. So the picture up there on the left is the location, general location of his murder on what was then the Anderson Farm property. The majority of that property later became the campus of Montgomery College. So then that lynching party then dispersed out toward Gaithersburg. So Rockville was a very different place in 1880 than in 1896. So that period of time marked an unprecedented amount of growth and development, mostly due to the B&O Railroad coming in. The Metropolitan line was completed in 1873. Here's the Rockville station on that line. So because of this, lots of commerce and industry sprouted up in the later 1870s, and by 1880, farmers were using the train to ship crops and grains and their dairy products to Washington and beyond. And multiple stores and hotels and other commercial businesses began to open to serve travelers and merchants that were increasing. Also, the wealthier residents of Washington were escaping the summer heat by building country homes or taking weekend retreats further up into Montgomery County than they had been able to come before. So here are some examples of what you would see in Rockville in 1880. The courthouse, which had been built in 1840, was a frame structure located in about the same place where the red brick courthouse stands today. The undertaker nearby was W. Reuben Pumphrey, who had a shop on East Montgomery Avenue, sort of where the Regal movie theater is now, less than a block from the courthouse. And directly across the street from the courthouse was the Montgomery House Hotel, not only a way station for travelers, but sort of the gossip hub of the town where you got all the day's news and happenings. Outside the center of town, the African-American neighborhood known as Hayti that Ralph was referring to had developed off of Martin's Lane. I don't have a picture of Hayti from this area, but here's, I think, a 19th century view of the Middle Lane neighborhood that Ralph also mentioned, which was a few blocks away. Another old established African-American settlement. So you can see a mix of homesteads, outbuildings, and gardens. Even further out of town, Black landowners were building houses in this area of Rockville, which would later become known as Lincoln Park. So here is the home of the Hill family, built by Reuben Hill in 1881. So this is the flavor of the town, the landscape of Rockville during this time of the murder of Mr. John Diggs-Dorsey. So a note about the hyphenated name that we're using. If you read the newspaper accounts of his lynching, you will mostly see this man referred to as John Diggs. However, most articles also state he had several what they called aliases, including John Dorsey, John Williams, and the given name Henry. In the 1880 census, earlier that same year, John is living with or near James and Mary Shafaley, for whom he worked. And he's enumerated as John Dorsey there. That's them at the bottom on the row of this census page. The Sentinel, which was the most local newspaper, uses Diggs once and then Dorsey throughout, suggesting that's how he was known around here. And several of the DC papers suggest he was well known there as John Dorsey, as part of a group of workers coming from DC. And also we'll hear later, possibly his father lived there. So we don't actually know which name he preferred. It seems he might have alternately used both. So we use both to try to represent his life as fully as we can. So I mentioned the Shafaleys, John Diggs-Dorsey's employers. James Shafaley and his wife Linnie lived between Darnestown and Seneca. So here's a turn of the century view of the intersection of Darnestown Road and Seneca Road, just north of their land, which is here. They had married in Washington in 1877 and purchased this land shortly after. By 1880, they had engaged a farmhand and general servant to work for them, the man we are calling John Diggs-Dorsey. On the morning of July 24th, 1880, James Shafaley went to Beltsville on business. Linnie had a normal day, entertaining some visitors. Her neighbor, Amos West, stayed with her through the evening until about 11 o'clock at night and offered to spend the night since she was there alone. And she declined the offer, saying that John was around. So Amos West left and went home. What happened next comes from an account given by Linnie Shafaley the next morning. after she turned up bruised and beaten, asking for help at the neighbor's house. She said Mr. Diggs-Dorsey had entered the house late at night, locked the door, and then physically attacked her and forced her upstairs, where he raped her and held her hostage with threats until morning. When she tried to escape later, she said he assaulted her, striking her with the arm of a chair or with his fist and disfiguring her face. She said he left the house later that morning, and then at that point, she escaped to the West house across the street for help. Hearing this story, Amos West raised the alarm, starting a manhunt for Mr. Diggs-Dorsey. So this was all according to Lenny Shafali's account, which was printed with frequent direct quotes in several papers, but none of the papers printed Mr. Diggs-Dorsey's side of events. So the next morning on Sunday, men were tracking a set of footprints, which they thought might belong to Mr. Diggs-Dorsey, and thought he might have headed toward Gaithersburg, a distance of about 7 miles, and boarded a freight train at this depot, possibly heading toward Washington. The postmaster recalled seeing a letter addressed to John Diggs from John Williams in Washington. So they opened that letter, and the sender claimed to be Diggs-Dorsey's father, asking for money. So based on this lead, Sheriff Kelchner and Frederick Shafali Sr., who was James's father, went to the DC police detectives, showed them this letter, and based on that, the police raided 2 houses in Washington that night, that of the suspected father of Diggs-Dorsey, named John Williams, and an unnamed person in the papers who was supposedly a sister of John Diggs-Dorsey, who was married. So John Williams lived in the southwest region of the city. Here's the Capitol building on this map for reference. And then we zoom in, here's East Street. And John Williams lived at 410 East Street in the 1880 census, somewhere in this block here. The married sister lived across the river near Anacostia, near where what they called the insane asylum at the time, which is now St. Elizabeth's Hospital. So like I said, their houses were literally raided by the police in the middle of the night, but neither resident had heard from John Diggs-Dorsey and could give no information on his whereabouts. So then we're on to Monday. All day Monday, rumors were flying, and a description was sent out via telegram that said, "Look out for and arrest John Dorsey, a very black man, 5 feet high, between 18 and 20 years old, dressed in dark coat and pants, slouch hat, and white shirt." So in the later afternoon on Monday, an old farmer named Zachariah Davis was driving back to his home in Sandy Spring. Just before Alney, he overtook a man walking on the road, fitting the description of the suspect, around 5 or 6 p.m. So this man was John Diggs-Dorsey. Davis offered him a ride, which he accepted, and when they arrived in the town, Davis asked him to hold the wagon while he went into the store. Davis went into the store, got a rope and a bunch of other guys, and came back out, and they all tied up John Diggs-Dorsey in the wagon. Zachariah Davis, with his adult son Edward, drove their prisoner back to Rockville, arriving at the jail around 11 p.m. and turning John Diggs-Dorsey over to Sheriff Kelchner. The sheriff immediately recognized the danger of an imminent lynching and began to gather a group of armed men to help him guard the jail from a potential lynch mob. The Davises then went across the street to the Montgomery House Hotel and began telling the tale of their brave capture of the fugitive. So as the word spread, a crowd of angry men began forming in town. But reporters who are reporting on this story indicated that a message had been sent from Darnestown to wait until James Shafali could arrive before they forced the jail. So those reporters hanging around town, some of them did interview Mr. Diggs-Dorsey directly, though none, as I said, printed an exact account of his version of events. A few of the accounts reported that he gave a full confession to the sheriff, saying he was drunk, but most of the accounts state consistently that he admitted what they called the outrage, which would be the rape, and that he cast aspersions on Mrs. Shafali. But all the sources state he strongly denied beating her. So reading between the lines, that suggests to me that in his version, the sexual encounter might have been consensual, but that someone else possibly had beat her up. Around 3 a.m, James Shafali arrived, and along with the already gathered group of men, now in masks and with appointed spokesperson, approached the jail demanding to see the prisoner. They were, of course, refused entry by the sheriff, but they rushed the building and disarmed him, while several of his recruits ended up joining the lynch mob rather than defending the jail. All reports state emphatically that Sheriff Kelcher made every effort to stop them. He did not, of course, fire his gun, though. He said later, if the men he had recruited had stood firm, that they could have held the jail. The men removed Diggs-Dorsey from his cell and forced him, still in shackles, to walk to a place half a mile, 3/4 of a mile outside of town, along the road towards Darrenstown. The intersection of Bullard Street, Laird Street, pictured here with West Montgomery Avenue, was probably at the edge of West Farm, which was referenced in some articles as the general location of the lynching. The group was met there or at a place on the way there by an unnamed man on horseback, which was a prearranged thing. The horseman asked those present to form a circle and swear an oath not to reveal the identities of each other, to protect themselves and their families. Once they arrived at the site, they insisted many times that he confessed to his crimes, but he denied the charges repeatedly, cursing them for what they were about to do. They said a prayer for him that he would be forgiven for his sins. They saw themselves as the righteous ones, fulfilling God's law as well as man's. There was a scuffle as he tried to escape again, and there was a moment where they tried to put him on a horse to give him a fall, but in the end, the noose was fixed around his neck. They threw the rope over the limb of a large tree, and then they physically hauled him up from the ground and held him there until he died. The men stayed there for perhaps 20 minutes and then dispersed, leaving the body to be discovered at daylight. So it's not recorded in the accounts who discovered the body. The next we hear, the local justices were summoning a jury of inquest, which would have been 12 men, which met briefly at the site where the body was still hanging. They heard several witnesses, including testimony from the jailer that he did not know any of the perpetrators, and what we refer to as the usual verdict in such cases as lynching was rendered that of death by violence committed by parties unknown, and the jury members were discharged. The grand jury in November's term of court reviewed this case and upheld this verdict, saying we have been unable to find any evidence that would lead to the conviction of the party or parties connected therewith. So during this grand jury session, the editor of the Montgomery County Sentinel had a problem not with the jury's verdict, but with the judge's charge to the grand jury. Judge Richard Johns Bowie, who was a former slave owner, not necessarily known as a friend to Blacks, still took the trouble to point out to the jurists that even though it was a rape charge, the accused had been owed a fair trial according to the law. He said, to know of a crime and not disclose the perpetrators is virtually to aid and abet them after the fact, indicating that most of the jurists likely knew the identities of the lynching party participants. But the Sentinel disagreed with the judge's opinion, saying in the case of rape, everyone knew the official court system was too slow and too lenient to rapists. Therefore, a rape victim's family was justified in avenging a raped woman by lynching the accused man to save her further embarrassment and to make sure the rapist was punished swiftly and severely enough to match the crime. So that was the statement made by the Sentinel. In response, the editors of the Baltimore American and Commercial Advertisers soon chimed in, published a piece criticizing the Sentinel. So as stated here, they considered the advocacy of lawful lynching would bring mankind back to the savage state. In response, the Sentinel doubled down on its interpretation of what the law should be. In fact, the writer stated in the case of both lynchings that had happened in Montgomery County that year, those of Mr. Peck and Mr. Diggs-Dorsey, that the guilt of the parties was conclusive, and their lynchings restored a sense of serenity from such violent outrages. So clearly, for a significant portion of residents here in 1880, extrajudicial murder was not only justified, but lauded as a necessary peacekeeping measure. Linnie Shafaley apparently recovered, and the couple continued to live in Darnestown until James's death in 1910. Linnie sold all the property and briefly moved to New York, but she died a few years later in 1916. The Shafalies are both buried here in the Darnestown Presbyterian Church Cemetery. John Diggs-Dorsey was buried in the County Poor Farm Cemetery, as was the custom for paupers and criminals, in an unmarked grave. So having died in 1880, he was likely buried in this newer section of the property purchased by the county in 1879 to relieve overcrowding in the existing cemetery plots. So today, this entire cemetery has been lost to housing developments and highway construction that took place in the 1960s. So we do not have a burial site for Mr. John Diggs-Dorsey. So now we travel forward in time. The continued growth of Rockville happened in a boom during the 1880s. And by the 1890s, land speculators had been buying up farmland and converting it into some of the first subdivisions. They touted Rockville as a resort destination. So the Montgomery House still stood, but now even larger hotels like the Woodlawn on Route 28 attracted tourists to the area, which supported even more commerce in town. The Woodlawn Hotel was in business for a decade, and then in the early 1900s was converted into a mental hospital called Chestnut Lodge. This structure was built practically across the street from where John Diggs-Dorsey was hanged in 1880. That property he was hanged on, which had been the outskirts of town in 1880, was now the fashionable West End neighborhood of Rockville, developed by Henry Cobb, who advertised it to white socialites looking for quiet residential living outside of Washington City. Businesses in town were also upgrading their appearance in line with more prosperity, newer architectural styles. Mr. Pumphrey's business, which had been a two-story simple wood structure in the early decades, was now operated out of a handsome brick structure, likely with apartments in the upper stories. And the 1840s era courthouse had been replaced in 1891 with a handsome brick tower structure in line with the growing prestige of the town. And several churches, commercial buildings, and houses in the town echoed that tower and peak cap of its iconic architecture. So at the same time that Henry Cobb was promoting his West End neighborhood, William Wallace Welch was buying up property around a few established Black landowners just outside of Rockville and advertising lots for sale in the first subdivision in Montgomery County to cater exclusively to Black home buyers, which he called Lincoln Park. The Cook family built this home in 1895, meant to evoke the Queen Anne style row houses they were familiar with in Pittsburgh. And in nearby Hayti, houses were also continually being upgraded and enlarged to accommodate expanding families. Here's the Ross home as it appeared in the late 19th century. So already Hayti residents were feeling the constraints of the city around them. As they were not allowed to purchase additional land around their community, they subdivided lots and added rooms to existing structures they had built. One structure that hadn't changed much in the intervening years was the jail building. And it was the same building from which John Diggs-Dorsey had been dragged to his death, and that same fate awaited a man named Sidney Randolph 16 years later. The story of Sidney Randolph starts with the Buxton family that lived in Gaithersburg. The Buxtons lived on the northern outskirts of town on what was then known as Frederick Avenue. So we're looking at a map of northern Gaithersburg. The center of town would be off screen at the bottom. We know they lived across the street from the Forest Oak Church and Cemetery. So probably somewhere on this property owned by Mr. Fulks. The Buxtons were a family of 5. Richard Lemuel, known to friends and family as Lem, was a recently elected town commissioner who worked as a miller. His wife, James Anna, was known as Teeny. There were 2 daughters, Maud, age 16, Sadie, age 7, and the youngest was a son, Carol, age 3. Also living with them was Mrs. Buxton's brother, Zadok Easton, but he was apparently not at home the morning of the incident. The incident that occurred in the early morning of May 25, 1896, when an unknown intruder broke into their house and attacked the Buxton family with an axe. So an intruder entered their home, struck the adults several times in their sleep, and then struck the children. Mr. Buxton fumbled with a revolver, but it misfired before he could aim. The attacker choked Mrs. Buxton and then ran out of the house. This was all at about 4:30 a.m. All the family members were hit at least one blow to the head with the blunt end of the axe, except for Carol, who was either in a cot in the corner or hidden under the covers between his parents. The daughters were more seriously hurt than their parents, but all the family members were still conscious. When Lem Buxton and his wife roused their neighbors from the Phoebus and English houses, and the doctor was sent for. When asked to describe their attacker, the Buxtons both said it was a tall black man, but could give no further description. So again, the news spreads quickly via telephone at this point, which was relatively well known, but relatively new, but well established in Gaithersburg. And local vigilantes scoured the area for suspicious looking black men. Frank Ward and John Garrett heard about a stranger walking along the road between Gaithersburg and Hunting Hill. So today that would be Muddy Branch Road. And the man walking there was Sidney Randolph in his mid-20s. According to his story given later, he had come up from Georgetown the evening before. He said he was an itinerant worker originally from Macon, Georgia, but had been working in Pennsylvania and then rotating between the Virginia, DC, and Baltimore area. He had slept in a barn the night before, and when the two men just rode up to him and began asking questions, he was afraid they were after him for trespassing. It was actually illegal to be a vagrant, that is homeless or out of work at this time. You could be sent to jail for vagrancy. In fact, Randolph himself said he had been jailed for vagrancy in Pennsylvania a few years before, the only time he had been in trouble with the law. So Garrett and Ward were not law enforcement. They were just two guys on horses, and informed Randolph that he had to come with them. He was scared and he tried to get away from them. In response, Ward shot at him several times, striking him in the hand and grazing his thigh. And Garrett ran him down with his horse and tied him up at gunpoint. Meanwhile, Reverend Lloyd, who was the new preacher at the Methodist Episcopal Church, and Deputy Sheriff Horton Thompson, the local deputy, appointed themselves as detectives and claimed that they followed footprints to the house where George Neal lived, not far from the Buxton's neighborhood. The townspeople informed the reporters that Neal had a grudge against Buxton for aiding in his incarceration in the penitentiary 8 years earlier. But I've researched that case and cannot find any indication that Buxton was involved at all as either an official or as a witness in that conviction. Randolph and Neal were actually not the only people arrested on May 25. The Justice of the Peace kept a ledger of arrests made, and on oath and information of Zadok Easton, who was that brother of Teenie Buxton, who lived with the Buxtons, warrants were issued for 5 of George Neal's family members: his sister, Emma Johnson, her husband, John Johnson, 2 nephews, James Johnson and John Young, who were ages 11 and 13, respectively. George's 74-year-old grandmother, Mary, was also issued a warrant, but apparently not arrested. So these people were all detained on the charge of aiding and abetting after the fact, suggesting that they were suspected of colluding with George Neal in some way. Then also arrested in connection with the case over the few ensuing weeks were Joseph Brooks, a friend of the Neal family who had visited them the night before the attack, 2 more Neal relatives, Charlie Neal and John Y. Neal, and Haler Maccabee, an older man who had been just walking to work that morning and may have seen the assailant running away. So these people, who were all Black, and including children, were held in prison for 2 weeks, at least in part to secure their testimony. None of the white witnesses were arrested or detained in connection with this case. Though the main suspects, Randolph and Neal, were initially taken to the Rockville jail on the afternoon of May 25 with all the other prisoners that had been arrested, Sheriff Collier quickly realized that they were in danger of losing their lives to a lynching. He put them into a closed carriage and sped them through town, also almost halted by a crowd assumed to be a lynch mob. He then put them on a train to Baltimore at Autry Park Station outside of town. So this is maybe the only reason that Sidney Randolph lived longer than John Diggs-Dorsey had, by this intervention and removal from local mob justice. Randolph and Neal were booked at the Central City Police Station in downtown Baltimore and remained there for more than a week. This is the record of their arrest taken on their arrival in custody of Sheriff Collier. Sidney Randolph, interestingly, gave his age as only 23, although he was reported in the papers as being in his late 20s. As we learned from Ralph, Montgomery County had no police department or trained detectives at this time. So to investigate the attack, State's Attorney Alexander Kilgore asked the Metropolitan Police in DC for professional assistance. Detectives Horn and Whedon arrived from Washington in the afternoon of May 25, but they were not allowed to interview the Buxton family due to their critical condition. The Buxtons were put on a train to Garfield Hospital in Washington later that afternoon. So almost right away, the DC detectives did not believe Randolph had been involved in this attack and tried to investigate other suspects like the neighbor, Mr. English, the brother, Zetta Easton, and even Mr. Buxton himself. But the townspeople soon refused to answer questions from the detectives because they were investigating the motives and alibis of the local white men rather than focusing on the Black men already in custody. So the detectives did not speak in detail to the press about their theories, but they did state several times that there was no credible evidence against either of the men suspected. Within 2 days, they had abandoned the case, saying that they were unable to investigate it due to the open hostility of the townspeople. Following that, Kilgore brought in 2 detectives from Baltimore who did still remain skeptical, but initially thought there was some credible evidence against Mr. Randolph, probably because they were lodging in the home of Reverend Lloyd while they were in town. And Reverend Lloyd was very clear about his view of the guilt of the suspects in custody. The problem is Sidney Randolph lacked any motive for this attack. He was a stranger in town. He did not know the Buxtons. No one in the Buxtons neighborhood was particularly wealthy, and the houses didn't look grand or likely to contain valuables. So robbery wasn't terribly plausible. And even if you believed the motive based on a supposed grudge Neal had, there was still no evidence linking Neal to the Buxton attacks, nor any evidence linking Randolph and Neal together. Neal's family members all testified to his presence at home during the time that the incident occurred. And when questioned, Lem Buxton outright said he knew George Neal and knew he was not the man who had attacked them. He said his assailant resembled another man named Clem Johnson, local guy, but it was not Johnson who attacked them. He just maybe looked like him. So a week after the incident, Randolph was taken to Garfield Hospital in Washington and shown to the Buxtons. At this point, Teenie Buxton could not identify him at all, nor even say whether her assailant was white or Black. Lem Buxton said he thought Randolph was the right man, but many sources also state he was also unsure. Neither of them were given alternative men to choose from, like a lineup we would have today. They were just presented with Randolph. So that seemed really inconclusive. However, things kicked into gear when Sadie Buxton, the youngest child, died from her injuries on June 5th, 1896. Forest Oak Chapel, across the street from her house, was the site of her funeral and burial, presided over by Reverend Lloyd. Her death prompted a coroner's inquest, but State's Attorney Kilgore decided that inquest would also serve as a preliminary hearing, since the suspects had been in prison for weeks without one of those preliminary hearings. And in fact, a group of lawyers in Washington had taken notice of this case and were putting pressure on the locals to take the proper steps. And we'll hear more about that lawyers group a little later. So the coroner's inquest / preliminary hearing lasted over 2 days in Gaithersburg, held in this building called Norman Hall, owned by John A. Belt. This photo of the Belt building was apparently taken in 1896 and could very well be from the day of the inquest. It was originally planned to be a closed hearing, but the jury decided to make it public, and Norman Hall was overflowing with eager onlookers and pressmen, as it looks like in this picture. Cordus Bauman was the justice of the peace. He was trained neither in the law nor in medicine, but was acting in this case as both judge and coroner. He presided over a 12-person appointed jury with 5 lawyers present. Of course, State's Attorney Alexander Kilgore, H.M. Talbot, who had been hired by Lem Buxton to assist the state's attorney for the prosecution, DC Attorney Ashley M. Gould, there for Randolph, Rockville lawyer Edward C. Peter for Neal, and another Rockville lawyer, George Minor Anderson, who was there for the rest of the 7 accessories to the crime, most of whom were Neal's relatives. Due to ongoing concerns for their safety, namely the ongoing threat of a lynching, the main suspects, Randolph and Neal, were not brought to Gaithersburg for this inquest, but they were brought back from Baltimore and put in the Rockville jail. So the legal proceedings represented here, an inquest, a preliminary hearing, they were not meant to operate like a trial. It was not customary for the defense to make any kind of statement or cross-examine any witnesses. The goal was for the state's attorney to convince a jury that enough evidence existed to hold the accused for further legal action. Questions of the witnesses were asked mostly by lead juror John A. Belt and by Justice Bauman. The assembled heard testimony from 37 witnesses, and it seemed from the testimony that the state's attorney had 2 goals in mind: to prove Randolph was in the Gaithersburg vicinity earlier than he had said, so basically to prove that he was lying, and to establish that he resembled Clem Johnson, who Mr. Buxton had claimed the attacker resembled. The last witness was, of course, Lem Buxton himself, who fingered Mr. Randolph directly as the assailant, saying he recognized him as the man he saw in the hospital who had attacked them that morning. The defense lawyers, Gould and Peter, did not dispute any of the testimony, but they later said that none of the evidence they saw presented would hold up in an actual trial, so they were not concerned about it. The jury, after 30 minutes deliberation, returned a verdict that Sadie had died from a blow to the head, specifically inflicted by Randolph. Many of the papers ran a headline of Randolph found guilty, even though this hearing had not been a trial. George Neal was released, along with all the family and witnesses associated with him, but Sidney Randolph was to remain in jail, awaiting his hearing before the grand jury, which was set to convene 5 months later in November, which would potentially result in an indictment. An indictment would then instigate a murder trial. So at this point in June of 1896, Randolph was still 2 steps away from a fair trial. There wasn't much reporting in the next 2 weeks. The investigation was still continuing. There were rumors of the Pinkerton detectives being hired to continue the investigation or to restart it. But the papers reported there was growing doubt that Randolph was actually the correct suspect. And by early July, it had lost steam and the story had not been covered for many days. But 2 things happened on July 3. Maud and Teenie Buxton came back to Montgomery County from Garfield Hospital and received much sympathy for their condition. It was suggested in the papers later that there was a rumor started that Maud may have been the target of a sexual attack, which was possibly the ulterior motive for the attack on the family. And this is what re-inflamed the lynch fever. But others said that the lynching was too well planned to be like a last minute rage thing and was more likely engineered by someone protecting themselves from the ongoing investigation. Also on July 3rd, the Sentinel ran detailed coverage of the lynching of Joseph Cocking, who was actually a white man who had been indicted already for a similar axe murder case in Charles County. That lynching had taken place on June 27, but had not been locally reported until July 3rd. And then eerily, printed on the morning of July 4, before the lynching of Sidney Randolph was known to their editors, the Washington Bee, one of the district's black papers, published this remark as if in premonition of Randolph's fate. The lynching of Cocking is an indication of what will be done with Randolph. Randolph is innocent, but someone must swing. Sidney Randolph was in his jail cell in the jail building that night when 20 to 30 men wearing red handkerchiefs over their faces aroused the jailer, Charles Payton, pretended to have a new prisoner for him, and when he opened the door, they pushed in and forced him to give them the keys. They quickly found Randolph trapped in his cell. According to a fellow prisoner, Randolph screamed murder, murder over and over and fought bitterly against his attackers. They literally dragged him out as he attempted to hold on to the floor grating. And eventually they had to hit him on the head to subdue him enough to take him out through the back door to a wagon waiting near the residence of Edward C. Peter, which stood across the street from the jail, right about where City Hall in Rockville stands today. He was taken in the wagon about 1.5 miles out of town to a prearranged spot. The reports mention that the lynchers took a circuitous route, likely to avoid driving Randolph right through the Black communities of Hayti and Middle Lane. Instead, they passed through the West End neighborhood, possibly even right past the lynching site of John Diggs-Dorsey 16 years earlier, and came out here near Frederick Road at the edge of the Anderson Farm property. So a portion of this stand of trees, possibly even the tree itself, may have still been standing in 1951, shown in this aerial photo of Hungerford Drive. You can see the proximity to Hayti, as well as to Lincoln Park, just across the road. They deftly avoided passing directly through the Black neighborhoods, but they made sure the lynching took place within unmistakable sight of them. The group of men hanged Sidney Randolph, still fighting them with all his strength from a chestnut tree. They didn't give him a fall, but hoisted him up from the ground and strangled him until he was dead. Based on the scene and descriptions of the body, it's obvious that his death was slow and excruciating. After the kidnapping from the jail, the jailer had gone to the Montgomery house and alerted several men to the situation. They followed the wagon tracks leading through West End Park to the scene of the crime, finding Randolph already dead around 4:00 a.m. the morning of July 4th. They noted that the wagon tracks continued away toward Gaithersburg, but they did not follow them. The magistrate summoned a jury later that morning, which visited the crime scene with the body still present. The body was then taken to Pumphrey's funeral establishment and later buried in the potter's field at the almshouse, same as Diggs-Dorsey had been. He was likely buried in the newest section here, which was also lost to development in the 1960s. The jury didn't render that usual verdict in a lynching case right away. This time, the inquest into the identity of those responsible continued in the courthouse over several days. According to newspapers, Rockville citizens were indignant at the lynching in their town, immediately blaming it on Gaithersburg men. Many people assumed that Lem Buxton had organized the event himself, and he quickly stated to the press that he condemned the lynching and desired the law to take its course. But the testimony contained the following revelations. Sheriff Collier had no idea an attack was coming. He had been moving the prisoner from jail for a few weeks, but had stopped doing that as the men from Gaithersburg, particularly John Belt, had assured him that they would let the law take its course and a lynching was not planned. The sheriff lived actually in Boyd's and had left Rockville in the evening to go home, leaving the jail in the care of Peyton. So he was not even present for all of this. Several of the Rockville young men were catching a train to Frederick the night before the lynching in preparation for a day of baseball games to be held on July 4th. Several of them heard a rumor that a lynching was planned before they caught the train out of town. And some of them also seemed to know about it already the next morning at the hotel in Frederick. Deputy Sheriff Thompson had received a letter from Milledgeville, Georgia, asking if the man they had in custody, Randolph, could be a fugitive from that area in Georgia known as Ben Temple, who was wanted there for murdering a minister's wife with an axe. So that letter will come into play in a second. The masks worn by the lynchers were all identical red handkerchiefs, tied with a particular kind of twine used almost exclusively by post offices. So John Belt of Gaithersburg both ran a general store that stocked handkerchiefs and held the position of postmaster for the town. The papers made that connection, and John Belt was very angry at the obvious insinuations in the press that he may have been involved. However, he was also heard by the jailer threatening Randolph in the jail cell a few days before the lynching, accusing him of using a false name and saying he hadn't many hours to live. Belt even admitted this on the stand. So Thompson had obviously shown him the letter from Georgia, and Belt assumed that Randolph was actually Ben Temple, the wanted fugitive. Lastly, several people had seen a group of buggies and wagons heading back to Gaithersburg in the early hours of Saturday morning. Francis Hall and his girlfriend Jenny Neal claimed they saw William and John Snowfer, the adult sons of G. Fenton Snowfer, sitting in a buggy outside of Washington Grove around 2 a.m., one of them wearing a mask over his face. Clarence Ennis, who worked as a farmhand for the Snowfers, said he witnessed William and John returning early that morning with exhausted horses, refusing to say where they had been. Hall, Neal, and Ennis, those witnesses, were all Black, and at least one of them was threatened for speaking out at this inquest. Testimony was heard from more than 40 men, some more than once, over 3 sessions on July 4th, July 7th, and July 13th. And initially, it seemed like the investigation was going somewhere, and newspapers reported it was likely that there would be perpetrators identified. But at the second session, there appeared suddenly a rumor that a group of Black men were planning to lynch Lem Buxton. So there was a huge overreaction in town with, in the white community, with armed men roaming the streets and Buxton hiding terrified in Gaithersburg. But it turned out to be an unfounded rumor. There was no plan. And also both Dr. Waters and Reverend Lloyd of Gaithersburg published their opinions of the case, of course condemning the lynching, but also reminding everyone that they believed in Randolph's guilt, which was not the point, but may have put a damper on the proceedings. By the third session, the enthusiasm had waned, and in the end, the jury rendered the usual verdict after all of that: death at the hands of parties unknown to the jury. 4 months later, a grand jury inquest into the lynching of Sidney Randolph was held in November of 1896, ahead of which Judge James B. Henderson admonished the jury strongly to discover the perpetrators of this lynching. However, the court papers reveal the witnesses called to testify, who included Lem and Teenie Buxton, Maud Buxton, Reverend Lloyd, George English, and Doctors Etchison and McCormick. These are all people who would comfortably swear that the perpetrator of the attack on the Buxtons was Randolph, but none of them seemed likely to have any information about the identity of the lynchers. Considering this was the testimony they heard, it seems unsurprising that not only did the grand jury fail to, quote, find anyone else responsible for Randolph's death, but they also indicted Randolph posthumously as guilty of Sadie's death, a finding that the judge had expressly told them was not within their purview. So like the inquest jury, they particularly exonerated Sheriff Collier, as in the Charles County lynching, both the sheriff and the jailer had been subsequently indicted as responsible for the lynching of Cocking and were plagued by legal cases that went on for several years. No charges were ever brought in the Randolph case. This continued miscarriage of justice spurred a further call to action from the lawyers group and concerned citizens in Washington, D.C., who had now organized themselves as the Anti-Lynching Society. Their first official meeting under that title was on July 16th, was led by John Mercer Langston, a lawyer and statesman with a law practice in Washington, who was also the founding dean of the Howard University Law School and a former Virginia congressman. He called lynching an act of anarchy and noted that the professional detectives from Washington did not believe in Randolph's guilt. The elected secretary of this group was Washington Bee newspaper editor, W. Calvin Chase, who in his paper had expressed anger and frustration at the lack of justice and the lack of due process of the law, saying, "What can the proud Caucasian race expect? Are we to be murdered and butchered with impunity, without due process of law?" Thomas L. Jones, who was Langston's partner in law, also made a lengthy speech about the lack of justice for Blacks in the system. And afterwards, those gathered passed several resolutions denouncing lynching, the first of which declared that we call upon all citizens to join us in an effort to stay this monstrous evil that is now so prevalent in our country. Montgomery County's Black citizens had also organized several orderly meetings in conjunction with the lawyers group in Washington to discuss their views of the lynching and potentially bring to light any information within the community that might lead to the arrest of perpetrators. So the testimony of Ennis and Hall during the inquest was perhaps encouraged by these sessions. In addition to the meetings in DC, one took place, what they said, north of Gaithersburg, which I think was Metropolitan Grove, and another was planned in Emory Grove, but actually postponed due to fears of an uprising that were expressed in the white community, going back to what Ralph said about not wanting to anger the white community in any way. In future years, members of the McKinley Republican Club, which was a Black political group centered in the Emory Grove, Metropolitan Grove area, retained a relationship with Ashley M. Gould, who had served as Randolph's lawyer. Also notable is the response from figures with more national recognition, largely because these two lynchings, Randolph and Cocking, had taken place within a week of each other. The governor of Maryland got involved, saying that these lynchings are to be greatly deplored and are a blot upon the fame of the state. He had demanded that the authorities in the two counties, Montgomery County and Charles County, should take steps in apprehending the perpetrators of these lynchings and meting out proper punishment. He even offered a $1,000 reward for information, which of course went unclaimed in both cases. And Ida B. Wells Barnett, already famous for her anti-lynching crusade by this time, was actually an invited guest at an August meeting of the Anti-Lynching Society that had been organized by Langston. In her comments on the lynching of Randolph, she said, "Many a Negro is lynched as a scapegoat for another man's crime." An editorial in one of the papers clearly states that the lynching of Sidney Randolph, the Negro lynched in Montgomery County, Maryland, was instigated by the real murderer of Sadie Buxton. Randolph was a scapegoat. However, she was heartened by the outrage that was engendered by the public over the lynchings, that she stated in her speech also, "Truly, the country is awakening, and I predict the early decay of that strictly American institution known as lynch law. My work is done." Unfortunately, as we all know now, the work was far from done. Though Montgomery County saw no more murders that were explicitly defined as lynchings, they continued across America well into the 20th century and beyond. It is a legacy of injustice that has remained with us to this day and has shaped some of the ugliest facets of our country's societal structure. Telling these stories, saying their names, and continuing to confront our uncomfortable history is the task before us. And to that end, our work is never done. In researching and creating these accounts of the 19th century lynchings in Montgomery County, I and several researchers who have assisted me have made use of the following sources in combination with each other. Digitization of 19th century newspapers across the country has provided much more comprehensive information on these cases than was even possible to find in the past. We've also made use of vital records and maps created during these time periods, and as you saw, delved into our extensive photograph collection to visually represent these places and people. So Montgomery History has used all this recent research to create multiple resources documenting these tragic events, including these published articles on the 3 lynchings, as well as extensive coverage on our website that goes into even more detail than I can give in this hour-long talk, found on our page called Lynchings in Montgomery County. So if you want more information on these cases, please explore all the content available there. I'd also encourage you to explore the work of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, as well as the work of the state and local commissions and advocacy groups listed here, who are all working to embrace the challenge of truth, remembrance, and reconciliation in our communities. Thank you very much for your time today and your interest in listening to and sitting with these difficult stories. that are and always will be a part of our county's history.
Sarah, thank you. That is extraordinary research that you've done, and we all benefit from this. I am looking at the Q&A. Please send in your questions. I'm sure you have many. One of the first I have is, well, can you tell me about the injuries to Mr. Buxton? I don't recall what you said.
So I kind of glossed over that because the reporting on that was very scattered. There was a lot of different reports floating around on what actually happened there. Apparently, the adults, Mr. and Mrs. Buxton, were hit in the head more than once each. Buxton, I think, had 3 hits. Mrs. Buxton had 2. And it was very, very odd because they stay, you know, obviously you would think hitting 3 times in the head with an axe would be, you would be killed. But apparently the assailant was using the blunt side, the blade, which is already weird. And then also, like, if you're hitting someone in the head 3 times, I think that would cause more damage. Mr. Buxton never really lost consciousness to any great degree. And several people commented on the fact that his injuries seemed very not severe compared to what they should have been or could have been. And that was, I think, a large part of the detectives being suspicious of this, because they're thinking, how could, you know, a strong man wield an axe at people and not actually kill them? So that was a very important piece of, you know, possibly Randolph being not considered a suspect in that case.
Yeah, interesting. Were you struck by any similarities between the 2 lynchings?
So the similarities actually between all 3 lynchings in Montgomery County, for me, that stands out is the fact that all 3 of these victims were seemingly, you know, I don't know for sure, but it seems like they were men without a solid community here in Montgomery County. We haven't been able to identify family members for any of them, honestly. And they seem to be sort of, you know, men on their own, trying to make a living, but they weren't really part of the Montgomery County community. And I think that's certainly in Sidney Randolph's case, that was, you know, the way he was made a scapegoat, because he had no one to defend him. He had no money to hire a lawyer. He had no one to stand up for him.
And as quickly as Neil was sort of, you know, exonerated,
yes,
because he was part of the local community.
Exactly. And Neil had actually been already, you know, convicted of a crime and had ostensibly survived lynching then, and was now back in the community and accused again and still alive. So that speaks to, you know, the fact that someone from the community, it mattered, whether they were from here or not.
You did mention that there was talk of a black mob forming to lynch Mr. Buxton. Is there any evidence? Is there any record besides some kind of secondhand references to this?
Yeah, so it seems like, I can't remember how many articles actually mentioned it. It seems like not a lot in my memory. It was kind of vague. Someone seemed to suggest that it was kind of like some guy shooting off at the mouth late at night one night, sort of suggesting that, and then the white community sort of took it and ran with it. And as I think Ralph mentioned, the Sentinel was doing a great job for many decades in instilling a fear in the white community of, you know, Black violence, of you know, they pretty much only reported on people in the Black community when they were in trouble with the law. And so there was this constant feeling of, like, you know, that there's going to be an uprising, there's going to be crime, there's going to be violence. And so the white community was all ready to embrace that narrative. Sure. And respond to it.
What's your personal opinion why the lynch mob took him around, I'm speaking of Randolph, around the communities as opposed to through the Black communities?
I mean, we can only guess. My guess is that they didn't want a fight. They didn't want to risk having their victim taken away from them. And like they wanted maybe the body to end up in proximity to the communities, but not necessarily have any risk to getting the prisoner taken away from them. And so that would be my guess, but I don't actually have any evidence for that.
I've got two questions about your research. To what extent were you able to identify primary sources, and were some of them located, say, at the Maryland State Archives? And how did that hinder or assist with your research?
So at first, we were going mostly off of newspaper articles, which, as I stated at the very beginning, are, not great. And it's very difficult to know what you're reading when you're reading those. But eventually, we were able to sort of get into the records a bit. Unfortunately, the kind of records that you would love to see, like transcripts of these inquests and these preliminary hearings and things like that, like actually writing down what the witnesses said and all that stuff, none of that exists. So it just either was not written down at the time, that was not the custom, or it was not saved in the records. So we have court papers and things. I showed a list of witnesses that were brought before the grand jury. There are little pieces like that exist in the court papers, which are held at the Maryland State Archives. And so we've tried to tease out like everything we can out of those records, but there's just not, like it's good. I'm glad we were able to get what we've gotten, original handwriting of the report and things like that. But like what you would expect to see or what you would hope to see in terms of really outlining what went on is just frustratingly missing.
Right.
So yeah, and so we did that. There's also a couple I've been diving in here at the Jane Sween Library and finding some, again, sort of tangential, but kind of informs the community. So some diaries of people who lived in the area at the time. They don't mention this case, of course, but at least I get a sense of how the community operated at the time. Also, I have some ledgers, for example, from the blacksmith shop down the street, who was, obviously serving a lot of the members of the community, but he makes a little note in one of his cash books of that he donated $1 to the Buxton family tragedy, so there's like these little pieces here and there that turn up in the primary sources that kind of add to the case.
Got one more, then two more. John Belt, was he part of the family that was given a land grant? Pre-Revolutionary Maryland, the Belt name appears on the winding Belt Road Northwest, which runs from Tenley Metro Stop to Chevy Chase Circle. At Chevy Chase Circle, there's a brass plaque and a large boulder commemorating the Belt land grant.
So he might have been part of that family, but he was not actually he might have come from the Montgomery County area from outside of it. As far as I know, he was not a long-term resident of Gaithersburg. He began purchasing property in the 1880s, I think, or late 1870s. Mm-hmm. He quickly became a very prominent member of the town. He was mayor for a while. I mean, he was a leader in the community, but I don't get the sense that he was like, a Folks or or a Diamond, those, or Rabbit in those areas. Those names went back generations, and like I said, he may have been connected with that Belt family, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Final question is, what's next? There still remains some holes. There are opportunities to fill in the gaps, and to what extent have you been assisted with other folks in this kind of work?
Yeah, lots of people have helped. I have had a lot of researchers in, connected with the Sween Library. Some people on the commission have done great work, uncovering some of the stuff at the state archives and kind of cracking that nut a bit. I think there is still more to find at the state archives. It's extremely difficult to research those papers, honestly, because they basically just put them in a box, and they're still tri-folded, they're still wrapped up real tight. And so when you go to unroll them, they're all, folded and difficult to read. And so it's very time consuming to look at those. And I also have more research to do at the National Archives, which is where the Metropolitan Police records are. COVID has been a real problem. I have on my list about 4 places I want to go, including Georgia itself. But, I've just not been able to get into these places. I had an appointment at NARA, and then it was canceled a
National
month
Archives.
ago.
So you go to Georgia to kind of pursue the Temple
Exactly.
line.
Exactly. So the thing that I always want to do, that we're always trying to do, is keep pulling at the thread of these victims and their stories, because they're, even though they're central characters, they're central to this narrative. We know the least about them.
Right.
And so it's been a real challenge to try to uncover anything about their lives. And, we keep trying. There's a lot of details about Randolph's life that we can pull on. It's just, it's so little information, and it's such bad information coming from the newspapers. It's very difficult to make sure that that's correct.
Right. Well, thank you. Extraordinary amount of work. It's we're very, very pleased with what's been accomplished so far, and look forward to sort of the next steps. At this point, I believe we have one additional council member we'll hear from, Mr. Hans Reamer. And then when we come back from that, Tony Cohen is really going to build on, I think, a lot of the themes that we've been hearing from already, and discuss an anatomy of a lynching. So please come back for that. Thank you.
My name is Hans Reamer, and I'm an at-large member of the Montgomery County Council. I am honored to be with you. In 2018, I was inspired to take action by the journey that we've shared together, the voices of our community leaders, and the work of Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative. Working with many of you who are here today, we created the Commission on Remembrance and Reconciliation to fully explore our county's history, confront our past together, and work towards a more just future. As someone who is passionate about the stories of our history, I find that I am always learning as I investigate and consider our past and just how distorted our view can be. There is something about how our consciousness as people is formed that I just don't understand. But somehow these veils of ignorance are laid over us through the narratives that we hear from the youngest ages. For example, just this year, I came to more fully appreciate the significance of the Tulsa Massacre, usually falsely portrayed as a race riot. The deep meaning of that terrible event has really been obscured. A point that Brian Stevenson has made that has always stuck with me is how, in Germany, after World War II, there was a sincere effort to acknowledge what they had done as a people and keep that story in the present so that everyone would have to continually learn from it, and hopefully history could not repeat itself. Well, we've never done that here, sadly. This country fought a civil war that ended slavery, but then compromised with the political coalition that supported the Confederacy, and never progressed to embracing the promise of equality or abolition. So it's great to see Confederate markers finally coming down. But as we celebrate, we also know that their presence for decades is confirmation of our failure to progress as a country. So we are here to reclaim the story and to reclaim the land itself. The ground where George Peck and John Diggs-Dorsey and Sidney Randolph were murdered is hallowed. One thing that we all have in common here is that we live on this land that we call Montgomery County. We share our lives on that land together. And by collecting the soil of those who have died by lynching, we are symbolically cleansing and reclaiming our land to hopefully one day fulfill the vision of free soil. Thank you for participating.
Hi, I'm Tony Cohen. I'm going to speak today about anatomy of a lynching, and today's presentation seeks to shine light on details of the 3 known lynchings of Montgomery County to reveal facts, known facts, and details of this event in a new light. And please excuse me, I am losing my voice. From 1880 to 1940, the chief period of lynching in America, diverse and disparate communities across the nation joined together to establish, disseminate, and uphold a system of white supremacy following the end of Reconstruction and stretching well into the civil rights movement. Lynching was one of the foundational components of this period and helped to codify an alternate system of justice for African Americans and other minorities. While no one author can stake claim to it, a playbook emerged, written by many hands and read over and over again by those who sought to enforce the established separate yet unequal application of Jim Crow law. I get one here. So today, I'm going to take you just through a few slides that I hope will help to illuminate the story we've been telling today. I first want to thank both Ralph and Sarah for their excellent presentations, because it kind of sets the stage. It gives the context, the background to what I'm going to tackle. The first thing I'd like to do, however, is just take a moment of silence in commemoration for the 3 men, Mr. George Peck, Mr. John Diggs-Dorsey, and Mr. Sidney Randolph, who were violently murdered in our county. And then we will continue. Thank you. So today's presentation is going to look at the playbook, so to speak. What systems, forces were at play that were repeated, not only in our county, but across the nation by different people, different communities, all with the same goal in mind when lynching was employed. We're going to look at methodology. We are going to see a system I put together called the limb scale. And after that, I'll read a conclusion, acknowledgements. We'll talk about the sources used, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So first of all, it was unwritten law, but there was definitely a playbook. We're not going to go through the entire playbook, but we're going to pull a few pages out today. First, what I think we should do is really drill down on some of the facts and fictions around lynchings. First, in terms of victims, one of the main fictions was a presumption of guilt. This went from the moment a crime was committed or alleged. Sometimes it even preceded a particular crime. So it was an accusation waiting to happen. The fact for many victims, few were charged or even tried in a case. So guilt was not being assessed through the legal system, but through the court of public opinion. Another fiction is that victims fit a known profile. When you read the many accounts of lynchings, first of all, it's African-American men primarily, and other people of color in different places in the country. But it didn't always fit that profile. By some estimations, about a quarter of all people lynched during this period were women and some children and members of other minority groups. Many of these victims were depicted in press as notorious or repeat offenders. So we often see in the newspaper accounts that someone being accused of such a crime was also said to have previously committed a similar crime or had gotten off the hook from something similar, and that justice was finally coming about. In fact, many of these so-called offenders were loners, as Sarah mentioned before, and many we are unable to find criminal records for. Another element, or I should say charge, that was frequently leveled against lynching victims or soon-to-be lynching victims was the notion of superhuman strength. They were described as powerful. I think Sidney Randolph was described as having a Herculean frame. And by this, it was assumed that the only way to subdue such a person, such a massive force, was through mob action. In fact, many of these people had some type of diminished capacity. They were actually younger than was originally reported in the papers of the time. Some of them had mental disabilities. I believe that was the case written about George Peck, for instance, and others we'll see later in this presentation. There are also fictions about the perpetrators of these crimes. Most frequently today, people looking back and describing lynchings describe the people who committed the crimes as vigilantes. They use terms that are associated with frontier justice. In fact, they weren't always sole actors. They weren't people who were just simply going off the rails, but they committed their crimes in tandem with the legal system that was at hand. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Another fiction is that these acts were spontaneous and they were actually triggered by these events. Allegation of an assault on a cherished member of the community, or for instance, officer of the law who'd been gunned down or murdered by a person of color. But in many of these cases, the fact is that these were coordinated events and that they were premeditated events. And when you didn't have a known perpetrator of a crime, one was often discovered in time. The third fiction for perpetrators of lynchings was they were parties unknown. And this was often the phrase that was used at the end of an investigation. This is what was used when the case was closed down. In fact, many of these parties unknown were respected and lauded members of the community who worked in tandem under a cone of silence to protect each other's identities and what they had done. And the fourth fiction is that they acted in defense of the law. In fact, many people who were lynched were murdered over non-criminal acts. That could be everything from whistling at a white woman, refusing to move off of a sidewalk to allow a white person to pass, or even scaring a white person. In 1889, I believe, a boy in Loudoun County was lynched after jumping out and scaring some white girls that he knew, who he was friends with, as part of a Halloween stunt. So the next page out of the playbook, if you will, is the lexicon. It's the language we use. And I just wanted to start this presentation out, maybe challenging or kind of upgrading some of our common phrases regarding the history of lynching. As I mentioned before, it was not vigilante justice. It might actually be described as vigilante injustice. More recently, with the work of the Equal Justice Initiative of Alabama, new terminologies have come up to better describe the forces at play. The term racial terror lynching is the term of phrase now, and it best describes the nature of these lynchings. Many of these people, outside of the crime or alleged crime that they were being accused of, were seen as predatory and were targeted because of their race. So we find that when the lynching of a person of color is in play, that all of the other types of racial stereotypes are also in play. So separating the race of the person from the act of or inspiration for the lynching is nearly impossible. We also refer to these crimes as extrajudicial killings. I would offer up a new phrase, kind of a new phrase, maybe a new application of an old phrase, and describe them often as parajudicial. Now, this isn't to be confused with paralegal, a legal assistant, but it is in fact, to my knowledge, only used in one place in law, and that is in France. So parajudicial is the French term for a paralegal. Because of its low use, I am adopting it for this presentation to describe how these illegal killings were actually achieved with a wink and a nod from the legal system, that the legal system actually had a carve out for lynchings. So it wasn't that it was above or beyond the law, but it walked in the shadow of the law and was recognized in many different ways by the law. Posse is a common phrase used to describe those people who gather to commit a lynching. And a posse is actually a term applied to sheriffs who gather up members of the community to help pursue a criminal. So we will use the term mob, and mobs formed usually with violent intent in mind. And so we will apply that term. And then there's the issue of familiarity versus formality. In life and in death, many African Americans who perished as a result of lynching were referred to not only in derogatory terms, but also in familiar terms by their first names only, sometimes referred to as grown men as boys. The work of the Equal Justice Initiative also promotes the use of formal designations, formal names. So we refer to all the lynching victims as Mr. or Mrs. and their full names. And I will maintain that throughout this presentation. So a little bit about the method that I'm using. In looking at the 3 known lynchings of Montgomery County, researching newspaper articles, firsthand accounts, one begins to see patterns. Sarah alluded to this earlier. And so my goal was to try and come up with some measure, some device, some system of tracking those patterns. So what I'm envisioning is a scale, something that applies certain levels or classification to action that is happening on the ground. And I'll just give you an example. There are many different types of scales. There are logarithmic. Yes, that one. There's power scales, which measure force. There are linear scales. You would use those for measuring things like temperature. I'm going for an empirical scale. Now, this is an observation-based scale. I just want to put up some examples against others. On the left is one popular scale that's used, and it is the Fujita tornado scale. This is actually more of a power or force scale, and it applies a certain value to the force of the winds from a tornado. You can see those numbers. I think they're 1 to 5. And next to them, you can see the wind speeds also mentioned, but it correlates with damage. And so there's the one column that lists the damage. Decades ago, when this was created, they started off with one model, but over time, knowledge in the field, observation in the field led them to enhance this particular scale. If you look below it, you'll see the enhanced Fujita scale, and it has extra columns of information. Another empirical scale, which is the Sapir-Simmons scale to the right, is the one we use to measure hurricane winds. Later, as time went on, you'll see the scale, but they'll add storm surge to it and other factors. So these scales are meant to be a basic measure of something that gives flesh to elements that may not be readily recognized. In the center, we have another empirical scale, if you will, Homeland Security Advisory System. And this might not even quite fit an imperial scale, but it alerts the public to levels of national security threats of terrorism. So it goes from low to severe with a description of the increments in between. So what I have created is what I am calling the LIM scale, which is Lynching Indicators of Mob Behavior. LIM scale is conceptual at the moment, but I think it's developed enough to give you an idea of where I'm going. So as part of the playbook, if you will, there are many factors at play, some of them social, political, sometimes they were economic factors that led to lynchings. I'm going to hone in on 2 factors. One is the coordination level of the mob. how did the mobs form, and what were the different levels or intensities of the mob violence, of the mob size and movements. And then next to that is the violence level. And by violence level, this is what acts of violence were perpetrated against the victim of the lynching. So in doing both of these, we're really looking at the actions of the mob, the actions of the lynch party. Nowhere here is there meant to be applied any judgment of the lynching victim, nor is there meant to be implied that people scoring different levels on this scale experienced a worse or lesser murder. All crimes are equal in this work. However, the magnitude of those crimes and the resources brought to bear to create those crimes are not always equal. So if we look to the scale on the left first, which is the coordination scale, I have created 4 levels of coordination. And I've applied names to them and descriptions of what that coordination is. This might not be the right answer. And what I'm hoping is as time goes along, I can work with other members of the historical community, and we can, really push in and fine tune this kind of work. But on the coordination scale, I've given the designation unilateral, and that is the spontaneous reaction to an accusation, no mob formed. So, and I'll give you examples of that in a minute. Bilateral is coalesced reaction, reinforcements, a mob gathers, and it's usually from the surrounding community. So this is still a local event. I am giving the classification of trilateral, which includes a 3-tiered coordination of the mob, is often premeditated. And besides the mob forming, usually has 2 other factors that are included, and that is support or encouragement from media, the legal system, or from law enforcement. And the 4th level on this scale I've named multilateral. This is an open source mix of local, state, or even national participation or players in the event. And we'll walk through some of those in a minute. The next scale is the violence level scale. And I have to say, I struggled with the keywords on this one, but I think we got something for a start here. So the standard level of violence means that the person was murdered usually with a single method, usually hanging for what we would call lynchings. The next level, enhance, involves that primary method of murder plus a secondary method of violence. The third level, which is elevated, is an amplified assault. This occurs either, this occurs post-mortem and may include things like mutilation. Ultra-violent is the 4th category. I'm classifying this as both pre and post-mortem assault, torture, mutilation. I can't even see the screen, my apologies. And other types of ritualistic practices. These are among the most violent and heinous of the crimes. The fifth one may be a little problematic. It's what I'm terming pan-violent. And the level of violence here does not increase for the victim, but gets extended to the community. So this is a case where one victim is chosen, but the impact to the surrounding community is imminent or sustained. All right. So let's look at our scale against the 3 known lynchings here in Montgomery County. And we'll start with the coordination level. Level 1, unilateral, spontaneous reaction to an accusation, no mob formed. Of our 3 victims, no one fits in this category, but our first victim, George Peck, in January of 1880, came close. One of the newspaper reports recounts how once the alleged attack took place, one of the neighbors to the attack came with the intention of killing Mr. Peck. But other people, I won't say intervened, but maybe caucused with this person. And it was then decided to call in law enforcement. So had he been murdered on the spot by just the people who were witness or who came to the scene of the alleged crime, would it be unilateral? Bilateral, the next level up, applies to both Mr. Peck and Mr. Diggs-Dorsey. There was a coalesced a mob which gathered from the surrounding community. And we'll talk about them a little bit more in a bit. The third level, trilateral, which was premeditated. It was usually a 3-tiered system, was applied to Mr. Sidney Randolph. Mr. Randolph, his case was lengthier within the community. He wasn't lynched within hours or days of the alleged crime happening. As Sarah explained, it took some time for them to even pick or choose or identify Mr. Randolph as their prime suspect. And then other factors came into play on his. The fourth, multilateral, I would say does not come into play in any of these. These were largely local events. If we take the different boxes from the different columns, we come up with a number. The number just correlates with the scale number, scale designation, which is an increase of 1 by each level. So under this, we would have Mr. Peck as a 2, Mr. Diggs-Dorsey as a 2, and Mr. Sidney Randolph as a 3 on the coordination scale. Sidney Randolph's involving more parties on the ground to affect the lynching. So now we're going to take a look at the violence scale against our 3 gentlemen. The first level, which is standard, didn't have a better word for it, which was a single method of lynching, we apply to Mr. Dorsey. It was what could be described as a simple hanging. Juxtapose that with Mr. Peck, the newspaper articles of the time say that he was not only hanged, but either shot or shot at as he was hanging. Further research needs to go into his case, because as he was captured and was being dragged to the site of his murder, there may have been other physical violence that was meted out that would bring him up a level. Mr. Sidney Randolph scores a level 3. He experienced elevated, amplified assault and post-mortem mutilation and/or post-mortem mutilation. Not so sure that we know that he was mutilated after the event, but he reaches that second level because he was assaulted in the jail as a means of subduing him so they could get him out of the jail and to the place of his murder. So Mr. Peck scores a 2, Mr. Diggs-Dorsey a 1, and Mr. Randolph a 3. And again, this is just observing the level of coordination amongst the mob, as well as the level of violence that they experience. This is clearly not a race or a contest. No one suffered a worse death per se, death being final. All right. So here I created a combined scale. It just puts the two scales together, stacked one on top of the other, and it adds up the numbers. So for violence and coordination, Mr. Peck scores at 4, Mr. Diggs-Dorsey at 3, and Mr. Sidney Randolph at 6. So a couple of things. Hopefully by using any kind of system like this, you're not simply racking up points, but you're starting to get a fuller picture of the event. George Peck was murdered at the beginning of the year in 1880. And one of the things I did as I was putting this together was look for other lynchings in our state or in our region at that time period. The records are out there. They're in many different forms. You'll go to different sources, which will say there were X amount here, a different source, a different amount. I believe in the state of Maryland, the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project has identified 43 or 44 lynchings that happened in the state, whereas the website for the Equal Justice Initiative has it at about 29. Let's see. And so I couldn't find any other actions that would have influenced Mr. Peck's attack. As Sarah mentioned, many factors could have affected Sidney Randolph's, namely the cocking, the announcement of the cocking lynching the day before. And Mr. John Diggs-Dorsey is very interesting because he was known, and I would assume somewhat intimate with the family he was living with or working for, which we could say may have lessened the intensity or impact of his lynching, i.e. a prayer was said, things like that. I'm going to move quickly through the rest of these for time's sake. If we take these same scales and apply them to other lynchings statewide, we get some very interesting results. George Armwood, Matthew Williams, who was lynched in Salisbury, Maryland in 1931, scored an 8 on the scale. This included pre-lynching assault, multiple levels of assault during the lynching, and post-mortem assault, which included his body being dragged through the street, recovered by police, taken back by the mob, and eventually set on fire. Notably, this was also an expansive event because other people, an unidentified man was killed as a result, and the Black community of Salisbury was terrorized. George Armwood, who was lynched in Princess Anne, Maryland in 1933, probably suffered the most violent and expansive lynching in Maryland's history. I won't go into it but in detail, but he was also believed to be of mentally disabled in some way, or some kind of intellectual capacity deficit. He was accused of rape, and he suffered a lynching that not only involved locals, but people pouring in from around the state, and input all the way to the governor's office. He was lynched, shot, mutilated. I believe his ear was cut off, and he was burned alive. On the national scale, we have 3 cases, and then we will close out this presentation. In November of 1898, we have a massacre in Wilmington, North Carolina. This is often referred to as the only coup d'etat to take place on American soil, where a white mob overthrew a largely Black government that had been put in place through elections. Estimates from 14 to 300 people died that day, mainly African American, and it was a full reversal of law and a full establishment of a white supremacist regime. That kind of lynching probably is a level that is not on my scale. The same with Frank Emery of Missouri, 1899, just a couple of years after Peck. We see him here. He has been stripped, and he is posing for one of several group shots that were taken of him that day with the mob, accused of rape. He was publicly whipped. He was hanged. He begged his lynchers not to burn his body because he wanted his family to be able to bury him. But one source said that the lynchers cut off his testicles and forced him to eat them prior to his death. The final one, William Brown, September of 1919, part of Red Summer, when there were race riots across the country. This took place in Omaha, Nebraska. And This is probably one of the most notorious lynchings in American history. You see the mob standing behind a glowing fire. What is burning on that fire is Mr. Brown. The mob secured him after hours of battle with city government in Omaha, where Mr. Brown had been secured at a courthouse, was guarded by police. The mob gathered, demanded he be turned over. The mayor steps out to calm down the mob and finds himself a near victim of the mob, who put a rope around his neck, swung it over a lamppost, and hours later, the mayor wakes up from a state of unconsciousness to discover he's been rescued. Brown is lynched, dragged through the streets. An interesting kind of epitaph to this is across from the lynching site was a newspaper press run by the father of actor Henry Fonda. And as a boy, I think he was 14 years old at the time, he witnessed this from the window of his father's printing press. The impact on him was so strong that it's believed it led him to pursue two roles in his acting career: the Young Mr. Lincoln and the Oxbow incident, both of which depict a condemnation, make a statement of condemnation against lynching. So on that more positive note, in conclusion, what this research hopes to do is by exposing and revealing long buried patterns, we will see more clearly those patterns that we take clues from even today. And by piecing together the playbook, if you will, we will cease to be enslaved to its unwritten law. Thank you very much. I also just want to quickly thank everyone who's on the screen, especially Montgomery History, and the groundbreaking work of Sarah Hedlund. If you haven't done it, just go to the Montgomery History website. There is a page for the 3 known lynchings, and just a wealth of primary and secondary sources are there. I'd like to thank Moko Lamp, the Commission on Remembrance and Reconciliation, Montgomery County Council, and the Equal Justice Initiative. I'll leave this up. It's suggested readings and the sources that I used. Thank you.
Tony, thank you.
Sure.
I can always count on you for
My pleasure.
bringing creativity. It's a provocative approach to this, and it's going to be very interesting to see how this evolves over time, because as I understand, it's a work in progress.
Yes.
So really interesting and excellent work. As before, please submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, please. Someone was wondering if there was a relationship between the portion of the population that was Black and white in an area, and how that might relate to either presence of lynchings or, on your scale, maybe the violence within that.
Yeah, so I did not specifically look for that data set, if you will,
Right.
but scales can reveal that kind of evidence. One of the things I would simply suggest people do is Google lynching scales, and you will find all sorts of like crazy algorithm things and work that's being done in university down to that kind of microscopic local level. So I think even
So how does your scales differ from the other ones that you found?
yeah, so mine is a non-scientific scale. So it is an empirical scale. It is just applying a measure, which is arbitrary, to a particular action or force of some kind. It gives you a guide, if you will. The other kind of research that's being done in universities and think tanks and whatnot are looking at so much more type of information. So I've seen scales out there that use all sorts of public records to figure out age of the lynchers, social or
The lynchers or the victims?
of both. But a lot of this work is actually looking to get into the minds of the mob, so to speak. So I would suggest just researching some of this. It'll make your eyes pop.
Wow. So that's interesting. And there was a question here. I'm going to read it in its entirety. It says, Mr. Cohen,
Sure.
I hear your disclaimer that this is not to be competitive between the lynchings, but I fear it might be. How can we be sure it is used in the right way? Also, how should a scale like this be used contemporarily?
Well, an empirical scale could be applied to almost any situation. It could be applied to modern police violence. What that scale does is it just measures a level of violence or levels of violence that were known types of violence and modes of violence against lynching victims. If we go and we comb through the papers and other firsthand accounts, what a scale like this can do is give us that first step. One of the things we realized in doing this research is these stories weren't simply covered locally, they were covered nationally. And as they were covered nationally, the information or the accuracy of the information expanded and contracted. Sometimes a paper in some far-flung location might have had a correspondent who was close to the action and gave a more accurate report. Or maybe the details came in later and more information had been gathered than a paper that might be closer and reporting on it every day, or a paper that was closer and had a community-based bias, maybe in support of the mob, couldn't more accurately report it. So even like mob size is very interesting. Now, you gather that information from somewhere, then you're going to want to dig down to different levels, which I don't think an empirical scale will do. But an empirical scale will tell you when you go into, Chipotle, do you want green, yellow, or red fire? You don't. They don't tell you, what the physical makeup of that is, but if you're a green, yellow, or red fire person, so you won't burn yourself. So that's kind of the value of these scales. It's a way of simplifying the information.
I believe it was sort of the, I don't want to say lowest level, but number one was sort of spontaneous individual action that resulted in the murder of in this case, black men. So how does that rise to the level of a lynching as opposed to sort of a standard murder? So that's the first part of the question. And then the second part is there are 3 confirmed lynchings. With an expanded definition of what might be a lynching, what does that open up in terms of additional research, you know, in the years between 1896 and the present day in terms of potential lynchings?
So the last part first, you know, I put in the slide of the Wilmington coup d'etat. That wasn't a lynching per se, but people were lynched as part of the event. And it was more expansive. So even changing, you know, using the kind of same scale, but just changing the name of it. It could be, you know, mob violence scale.
Sure.
It could be mob coordination. So that removes, you know, the specific focus on lynching and could be more wide ranging.
What about an instance like Keith Warren?
Yes, I'm glad you brought up Keith Warren. So Keith Warren was Montgomery County citizen. He attended JFK Kennedy High School in the 1980s. And in the mid 80s, he was found dead in a wooded area with a rope around his neck, hanging. His family and other people in the community have long held that he had no enemies, that he wasn't in trouble for anything, and that this was likely a lynching.
It was officially ruled a suicide?
It was officially ruled a suicide. But even the situation around that was very strange. After the case was closed, photos were sent to Warren's mom, Mr. Warren's mom, which show police crime scene and reveal for the first time that Keith Warren's hands were behind his back. They were bound. There was nothing, for instance, in the picture that would indicate suicide, like you know, him, you know, jumping off of a bucket or a chair. It was very mysterious, and none of these details were described to the family at the time of the investigation. Also, it appears that the Montgomery County Police wiped some of the evidence. So evidence doesn't survive today to tell the story. For instance,
this was in 1980.
86, I believe.
86.
So for instance, Mr. Warren's body was sent to the coroner and I guess was embalmed prior to his family getting to see him. So how do we classify that? I think at the moment we're best positioned to say suspected lynching. I think we are also free to open up investigations. I know that Councilmember Hans Riemer has called for the reopening of that case,
Right.
as well as Moco Lamp.
Right. Tony, do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, just simply that I think a number of years ago, as grassroots organizations started, you know, coming together, inspired by the Equal Justice Initiative, to memorialize, remember and memorialize these events and these people who've been lost to history, that the question at the time was, well, this is really important, but, you know, why raise the dead? Why dig this up? And, then we fast forward to this year on the heels of George Floyd, January 6th at the Capitol, where a gallows and a noose is erected on the lawn of the Capitol to hang the vice president. This is an impulse that has never been, that we've never rid ourselves of. So that's why it's important that we keep studying and telling these stories, because I believe it's a story about ourselves today.
Right. All right. Well, thank you.
You're
And
welcome.
Tony, you've been instrumental in the establishment of the Montgomery County Lynching Memorial Project, and I know we're going to be hearing much more from that organization in the future. I know you have a lot of great plans. But
Thank you.
just in closing, just please be aware that the symposium has been recorded, and we will post it on our website, montgomeryhistory.org, by early next week, perhaps as early as Monday. Also, we'll be sending to everyone who signed up for the event a free PDF of the most recent issue of the Montgomery County Story, which Sarah held up. That's our research publication, and it includes Sarah's definitive account of the Randolph lynching. I would be remiss at this point if I did not thank Matt Gagel, our Director of Programs, who has been doing extraordinary work as he always does behind the scenes. The symposium simply would not have been possible without his technical know-how, some of his personal equipment, as well as his calm demeanor. If you would like to see more of Matt, join him every Tuesday afternoon for History Conversations. It's a streaming program in which we feature local history stories every week. And you can learn more about that also on, excuse me, on montgomeryhistory.org. I want to thank all of our members and supporters who make free programming like this possible. It's their generosity that enables us to tell stories that are important and reflect the experiences of everyone in Montgomery County. So in conclusion, as I said at the outset this morning, our goal is to stimulate further research and discussion in the community. Lynchings were shocking and headline grabbing, but there were countless other forms of discrimination and racism that persisted for decades after the last lynching that impacted and continues to impact Blacks in this county. Those topics, housing discrimination, access to education and jobs, treatment by law enforcement in the criminal justice system, those all demand greater exploration. Montgomery History is committed to uncovering the past and making those stories relevant, accessible, inclusive, and engaging. I hope you'll join us in that very important and timely journey. Now, finally, just a reminder, I want you all to sign up to attend the soil collections ceremony tomorrow. I've received an email with additional information on that. It will be live streamed by Montgomery Community Media. If you go to mymcmedia.org, you'll be able to find information on the Remembrance Weekend where you can live stream and see the video. And they're encouraging everyone to arrive by 3:40 p.m. There'll be music, choral music, and then the ceremony will start promptly at 4 p.m. And again, that's at Welsh Park, Manakee Street, and Martins Lane here in Rockville. So with that, I want to thank the three speakers again, Ralph, Sarah, and Tony. And thank you for your incredible research and your contribution to scholarship on this topic. And for all of you, thank you for joining us. Have a great afternoon.